What would you do if your neighbor called the police to arrest you for sunbathing in your pool? The thought ran through my mind as I sat back in my favorite lawn chair, a glass of iced tea in my hand, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on my face. It was one of those peaceful days where the sky seemed impossibly blue, and the only sound was the gentle splash of water in my small above-ground pool. Life felt simple, good, and worry-free. At least, it did until that knock on the door. I had just settled into my chair, the kind of relaxed moment that made you feel like you had all the time in the world, when the sound of a knock interrupted my thoughts. It was quick and sharp, the kind of knock that makes you wonder who could possibly be on the other side of your door. I glanced at the clock. No one ever dropped by in the middle of a sunny afternoon, unless it was for something important. Or, in my case, something unexpected. I stood up and walked slowly toward the door, my mind already racing with possibilities. Who could it be? Maybe it was one of the neighbors, though I couldn't think of anyone who would stop by without a reason. I swung the door open, and there they were, 2 local police officers, both standing on my front porch with a look of mild confusion on their faces. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the man said, his voice steady but formal. He was tall, with a gruff expression that seemed at odds with the warm weather. "We received a call about a disturbance. A neighbor reported, well, that you were sunbathing in your pool." I stared at him, blinking a couple of times. This had to be a joke, right? I mean, I could barely believe what I was hearing. A disturbance? Sunbathing in my own pool? What could be disturbing about that? I chuckled nervously, hoping it was some kind of mix-up. Sunbathing? You mean lounging in my pool? I've been doing that for years. Do I look like I'm disturbing anyone? The second officer, a woman with a calm demeanor, looked over at me and raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure whether I was playing some kind of joke or if I was genuinely confused. "Well," she said, "apparently your neighbor disagrees. Could you step outside for a moment?" I didn't know what to think at this point. My heart was racing, and all of a sudden, the backyard where I had spent countless peaceful afternoons felt like a courtroom. I agreed, still feeling like I was in some kind of surreal dream. The officers followed me through the house and out to the backyard. As soon as we stepped outside, I realized my neighbor Mrs. Whitaker was standing on her porch, glaring in our direction. She looked like she had been waiting for this moment, arms crossed and mouth pursed tightly as she watched us approach. I had seen her around before, always keeping an eye on things, but I never expected her to call the police on me. "Ma'am," Officer Stevens continued, looking at Mrs. Whitaker and then back at me, "we've been called multiple times about noise and disturbances coming from this property. Could you tell us what you've been doing?" I could feel the confusion building up inside me, the absurdity of the situation sinking in. "I'm just relaxing in my pool. I play a little music, but it's not loud." I thought everyone liked a good summer vibe. Mrs. Whitaker, who was now shaking her head in disbelief, chimed in, "It's not just the noise, dear. It's the principle. People should act with some decorum in a neighborhood like ours. Why, in my day, we would never dream of such shameless behavior." I was stunned. Shameless behavior? Was she seriously saying that enjoying a quiet afternoon by the pool was somehow disgraceful? It wasn't like I was throwing a party or causing any trouble. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. "With all due respect, Mrs. Whitaker," I began, my voice calm but firm, "this is my home, and I'm not breaking any laws. If anything, I'm providing a little joy in the neighborhood. I'm not disturbing anyone." The officer, sensing the rising tension, stepped in before the argument could escalate further. "Let's all take a deep breath," Officer Maynard said, her voice soft but authoritative. "Maybe you could just keep the music down a bit, ma'am? And Mrs. Whitaker, perhaps it would help to remember that summer is a time for people to relax." We all stood there for what felt like an eternity, exchanging polite but pointed words. It was like we were stuck in some strange mediation session, and I couldn't help but feel like I was the one being judged. Finally, after a few more back and forths, Officer Stevens nodded and turned to me. "I think it's clear that there's been a misunderstanding," he said, giving me a quick, apologetic look. "Just try to keep it down for your neighbor's sake, all right? Mrs. Whitaker," he added, turning toward her, "please refrain from making any more complaints unless it's absolutely necessary. As the officers started to turn away, I couldn't resist. I gave a little smile and called after them. "You guys want to stick around for a barbecue later? I promise no loud music, just good food and company." To my surprise, both officers chuckled and waved as they walked away, as though the whole situation was just some strange, quirky moment in their day. I stood there for a moment, still processing everything. Could this really have happened? Was I somehow caught in the middle of a neighborly feud over something as simple as sunbathing? I couldn't help but feel a little deflated as I walked back inside. The afternoon sun no longer seemed as warm or inviting. I thought about Mrs. Whitaker's disapproving glare and the officers' uncomfortable looks, and I wondered how I could have handled things differently. Maybe I had been too defensive, too quick to dismiss her concerns. Or maybe I was just the unfortunate target of someone who took things a little too seriously. But as the sun began to set and I settled back into my pool chair, a new thought began to form. Perhaps I could try to make peace with Mrs. Whitaker. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but maybe this misunderstanding could be a chance to open the door to something new. Something beyond the grumpy neighbor with the judgmental frown. But that would have to wait for another day. For now, I just wanted to enjoy the quiet. I stood in the quiet of my backyard, the warm evening air now tinged with the scent of grilled food from nearby houses. The sun had slipped behind the horizon, leaving behind a soft, golden glow, but it did little to lift the cloud that had settled over me since the officers left. I had tried to shake off the weirdness of the day, but it was hard not to feel the weight of Mrs. Whitaker's disapproving gaze from across the fence. As I sat back down in my lawn chair, sipping my iced tea, I kept replaying the scene in my mind. Could there have been a better way to handle it? Did I come off as rude, defensive? Or was I right to stand my ground? The thought of making amends gnawed at me. In my heart, I knew I wasn't in the wrong, but I also couldn't ignore that Mrs. Whitaker had been a constant presence in my neighborhood. She was the one who always made sure the mailboxes were standing upright, the lawns trimmed just so, and, evidently, the one who decided what was appropriate for the community. I had grown up in a different kind of neighborhood, where everyone minded their business and the occasional chat over the fence was a friendly exchange, not an interrogation. But here, in this quiet suburban street, it felt like there was an invisible code everyone adhered to, and I had just unknowingly broken it. I stood up from my chair and began pacing, trying to make sense of it all. The back and forth with the officers, the odd sense of guilt, and the question that still lingered in my mind. How can I fix this? I had been ready to ignore Mrs. Whitaker, to chalk it up to a weird misunderstanding, but something inside me told me that was the wrong approach. I glanced over at her house again. She was on her porch, her silhouette barely visible against the dimming light. She was probably just waiting for the next disturbance to report, no doubt keeping her eye on the neighborhood as always. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt a surge of determination. What if I invited her over? I muttered to myself. The idea seemed a bit out of the blue. After all, who invites the very neighbor who just called the cops on them to a barbecue? But as soon as the thought entered my head, I felt like it might just be the bridge I needed to cross. I wasn't sure if it was pride or a desire for peace, but I decided I would give it a shot. If she was going to keep an eye on me, the least I could do was offer an olive branch. What's the worst that could happen? She might turn me down, or she might just come and make another snide remark. But what if this could be the first step toward making things better? I grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, my mind already racing with how I would word the invitation. It couldn't be too formal, or she'd dismiss it as another pleasantry without any real effort. It had to be light-hearted, inviting, and sincere. I scribbled a quick note. Dear Mrs. Whitaker, I wanted to personally invite you to a summer barbecue I'm hosting this weekend at my house. I've got burgers, hot dogs, and plenty of good food, and I promise no loud music. Just a chance to relax and enjoy some good company. I'd love for you to come and join us. Best regards. Your name. It was simple enough, but I made sure to add a little personal touch, drawing small doodles of palm trees and a grill at the bottom. It wasn't much, but maybe the playful touch would soften her up a bit. After all, how could she resist a barbecue? I grabbed the invitation, folded it carefully, and walked over to Mrs. Whitaker's house. The distance to her front door felt longer than it actually was. My heart raced a little faster as I approached her mailbox, my hand gripping the paper tighter. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe a slap in the face, or a stern lecture about the proper way to behave in a neighborhood, but I had to at least try. Just as I reached her mailbox, I saw movement through her curtains. I froze. It was too late to back out now. Mrs. Whitaker was undoubtedly watching me. Maybe she was waiting to see if I'd make any more mistakes, or perhaps she was hoping I'd crumble under the pressure. A moment of hesitation passed, but I slid the invitation into her mailbox with as much grace as I could muster. I quickly stepped back, my mind racing with what I had just done. My eyes darted to her porch again, and for a second, I could have sworn I saw her peering out at me through the curtains, but then the door remained closed. I turned to leave, my pulse still elevated, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. What if she didn't show up? What if she didn't even care? Still, I had to hold on to the small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, the offer would be enough to start a conversation to make things right. The hours dragged by as I prepared for the barbecue. The smell of grilled meat filled the air, and I set up a picnic table, strung up some lights, and put on some music, soft, mellow tunes, of course. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and I couldn't help but feel a little anxious. Would she come? Or was this whole gesture just a futile attempt at peace? The evening passed slowly, and I tried to keep my mind occupied. The backyard began to take shape into something special, a cozy gathering place, filled with the anticipation of a potential neighborly reunion. But as the sun set and the glow of fairy lights flickered on, my thoughts kept drifting back to Mrs. Whitaker. And then, just when I was beginning to wonder if I had made a huge mistake, I saw it, a movement from next door. Mrs. Whitaker's figure appeared in the doorway, a little hesitant but undeniably intrigued. She stood there, watching for a moment, before stepping off her porch and walking cautiously toward my yard. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up straight, smiling nervously as I waved in her direction. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, perhaps a curt nod and a polite refusal, but to my surprise, Mrs. Whitaker actually walked toward me. She was holding the invitation in her hands, and her face was less stern than usual, though still tinged with caution. "Well," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I did bring some potato salad." She held out a container wrapped in aluminum foil, clearly a peace offering of her own. I couldn't help but laugh, the tension in my chest easing slightly. "Wonderful," I said. "Come on in. Let's enjoy the evening and forget about all the fuss. Summer is for relaxing, after all." She stepped closer, still with that skeptical air about her, but there was something else there too, a hint of curiosity, maybe even a little relief. It was then that I realized that Mrs. Whitaker wasn't just my neighbor. She was someone who, despite her gruff exterior, could perhaps be reached if I made the effort. As she sat down at the table, placing her potato salad next to the chips and fruit salad I had made, I realized this barbecue wasn't just about good food. It was about opening the door to a new kind of relationship. It wasn't going to be perfect, and we might never be best friends, but this was a start. And as the evening went on, the ice between us started to melt. We exchanged stories, some funny, some a little awkward, and slowly, I could see a shift in her attitude. She wasn't the same woman who had called the police on me just a few days ago. She was someone with history, with stories to share, and I realized, to my surprise, I wanted to hear them. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Mrs. Whitaker than I had originally thought. And maybe, just maybe, this barbecue could be the first step toward turning a neighborly misunderstanding into something more. The evening had settled into a rhythm that felt both comforting and strange. Mrs. Whitaker, with her quiet, reserved manner, was slowly loosening up as the night wore on. We were no longer two neighbors on opposing sides of a fence. We were two people sitting at a picnic table, sharing food and stories, with a distant hum of summer evening sounds filling the air. Her potato salad, despite its humble appearance, was delicious, rich with tangy dressing and just the right amount of seasoning. I tried to compliment her on it, but she waved it off with a modest shrug. "It's nothing fancy, dear. Just something I've been making for years." Her tone was gentler now, no longer laced with the sharpness I had grown used to. The air between us seemed to shift, like a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, I saw her not as a difficult neighbor, but as a woman with a story, a history, just like me. So, I began, my curiosity getting the better of me. How long have you lived in this neighborhood? Mrs. Whitaker took a slow sip of her lemonade, her eyes drifting off toward the trees lining the street. Oh, quite a while, she said, her voice distant for a moment. We moved here in the early 70s. My husband and I bought this house when it was just a little street with barely any trees. It's changed so much since then. Her words caught me off guard. I had assumed she'd been a lifelong resident, maybe someone who was always concerned about the neighborhood's image, but the way she spoke about it, about the old days, felt personal. She wasn't just an old-timer trying to hold on to the past. She had lived through changes, just like the rest of us. I leaned in slightly, more intrigued now. What was it like back then? I mean, how was the neighborhood different? A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Oh, it was quieter for one. And people kept to themselves a bit more. But we had a strong sense of community. Everyone helped each other out, you know? I remember when the Smiths down the street had their first baby, and the whole block came together to throw them a party. It wasn't anything fancy, just a barbecue like this one, but it felt like something special back then. I nodded, feeling a sense of nostalgia creeping in. There was something deeply comforting about hearing her reminisce about a time when neighbors were truly neighbors, when everyone pitched in, not just for big events but for the little moments too. I could see it now, how that sense of togetherness must have shaped her ideas about what a good neighborhood looked like. I guess things have changed, I said slowly, more to myself than to her. Yes, they have, Mrs. Whitaker replied, her voice dropping to a more thoughtful tone. But not always for the better. People are more isolated these days, don't you think? More focused on themselves, less on the community. I could feel my heart rate pick up slightly. This was the opening I'd been waiting for, the chance to tell her what I'd been thinking all evening. I think you're right, I said. It's easy to forget how important it is to be part of something. Sometimes it feels like people are just going through the motions, you know? But today, sitting here with you, it feels different. Like we're actually connecting, like we're part of something again. Mrs. Whitaker met my gaze, her sharp eyes softening. For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of the conversation settling between us. She cleared her throat and shifted in her seat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. Well, maybe I've been a bit too focused on what I think people should be doing, she said, almost to herself. I guess with age, you start to think about things differently. I smiled, surprised by her admission. It's never too late to change, right? She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. I suppose not. A long silence followed, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It felt like a mutual understanding had formed between us, one that was a bit messy, a bit imperfect, but real nonetheless. This wasn't the rigid, by-the-book interaction I had expected from Mrs. Whitaker. It was the beginning of something different. The evening continued in a quieter, more relaxed way. We finished our meal, and I offered to clear the table, but Mrs. Whitaker insisted on helping. As we worked together, side by side, I realized how natural it felt. It was just two people, two neighbors, finding a way to make something work, even if it had started with a misunderstanding. As I wiped down the last of the dishes, Mrs. Whitaker looked over at me. You know, she said, her voice tinged with something almost playful, I don't mind the music as much when it's not so loud. It does give a nice summer feel. I couldn't help but laugh, relieved to hear her say it. I'll take that as a compliment, I said with a grin. She chuckled softly, a sound I hadn't expected. It's not much of a compliment, but I suppose you're doing something right with your music. Just keep it down a bit, and we'll get along just fine. I raised an eyebrow. Just fine, huh? That's a pretty big improvement from the police intervention, don't you think? Her lips quirked up into a smile, the first genuine one I'd seen from her all evening. Well, I suppose it is. But I do like my peace and quiet, you know. Understood, I said, winking. I'll make sure to keep the peace from now on. Mrs. Whitaker didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out over the yard, her expression thoughtful again. You know, I never thought I'd be sitting here, having a decent conversation with you. But I'm glad I came over. I felt a warmth spread through me at her words. Me too. I'm glad you did. We stood there for a moment, simply looking at one another, the evening stretching out before us. It was a strange thing. How a simple invitation, born from an awkward and frustrating misunderstanding, could have led us to this moment. Maybe we weren't best friends, and maybe we never would be. But something had shifted. We were no longer just two neighbors who barely knew each other. We were two people who, despite our differences, had managed to connect. And that was enough for now. As she gathered her things and began to make her way back to her house, Mrs. Whitaker turned to me once more. You know, she said, her voice soft but sincere, I might just come over for another one of these barbecues sometime. I could get used to this. I smiled, my heart lighter than it had been in days. I'd love that, I said, watching her walk back to her porch. The night had turned into something more than I had ever expected. And as I looked over at the soft glow of my backyard lights, I realized that what started as a small misunderstanding had blossomed into something meaningful. An unexpected connection that might just grow into something even better. The weeks after that barbecue felt like a quiet exhale, like the tension that had hung in the air between me and Mrs. Whitaker had finally dissipated, leaving room for something new. Our interactions became smoother, more natural. I would wave when I saw her tending to her flowers, and she'd offer a nod or a half-smile in return. Sometimes, she'd even stop by to chat about the weather or share a gardening tip. It was a strange feeling, this slow, steady shift from neighborly tension to genuine camaraderie. One afternoon, as the sun blazed high and the neighborhood seemed to pulse with the usual hum of summer, I decided to take a break from my usual routine. I had spent the last few hours lounging by the pool, reading and listening to soft tunes. The gentle ripple of the water was the only sound in my yard, and it was blissful. Just as I was about to close my book and go inside, I noticed something unusual. Mrs. Whitaker's porch light was on, but she was nowhere to be seen. Her front door was wide open, and the curtains were swaying lightly in the breeze. At first, I thought she must be inside, but then I saw a figure in her yard. Her cat, a scruffy little creature who often darted around her bushes. He was standing still, staring into the distance. Something about the scene felt off. My eyes narrowed as I took in the open door, the stillness, the way the cat didn't seem to move despite the breeze. Something wasn't right. I stood up, brushing the grass from my shorts and making my way slowly toward the edge of my yard. My heart rate quickened, and I could feel a knot tighten in my stomach. Mrs. Whitaker wasn't answering my wave when I gave it, and now her house felt eerily quiet. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't sure what it was, but an instinct told me I needed to check in. I crossed the grass, my footsteps barely making a sound. By the time I reached her gate, I noticed her back door had been left ajar as well. I hesitated for only a second before pushing it open, feeling a wave of concern wash over me. The house was unusually still, the silence heavy. "Mrs. Whitaker?" I called out softly, stepping carefully into the hallway. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet, like it could shatter something delicate. No answer. I made my way through the kitchen and then toward the living room, peeking around the corners as I did. Her house wasn't large, but it was cozy, with knickknacks and old family photos scattered about. The space was familiar to me now, from the barbecues and the chats. But today, something about it felt different, unfamiliar. I glanced down the hallway toward her bedroom, the door slightly ajar. I could see a faint light coming from inside. As I approached, I found the door gently creaking open, and my breath caught in my throat. There, on the floor of her bedroom, was Mrs. Whitaker. She was lying on the floor, half-conscious, her face pale and strained, and a thin line of sweat glistened on her forehead. My first instinct was to rush to her side, but I forced myself to stay calm, trying not to panic. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and I could tell she was still alive, though clearly in distress. I knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her arm. "Mrs. Whitaker? Are you okay?" I said softly, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to steady it. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she just stared at me, confusion clouding her gaze. "What?" she whispered, her voice weak. "Don't try to get up." You've had a fall, or something. Do you need me to call someone? I asked, my voice tinged with panic now. She blinked a few times as if she were trying to clear the fog from her mind. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. She closed her eyes again and sighed softly, as if gathering the strength to speak. I'm fine, she finally said, but the words were faint and unconvincing. Just dizzy. I wasn't buying it. I immediately grabbed my phone, dialing 911 without hesitation. The operator answered quickly, and I relayed the details. Please, send someone right away. She's fallen, and she's not making sense. I think she needs medical attention. The operator assured me that help was on the way, and I stayed by Mrs. Whitaker's side, keeping a careful eye on her condition. Slowly, I helped her sit up, keeping my hand on her shoulder for support. You don't need to hide anything from me, you know, I said gently, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me fully. Whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm here to help. She gave a small shake of her head, her eyes half-lidded. It's nothing, she whispered, but it was clear that whatever was happening to her was more than just a simple fall. The tension in the room was suffocating, and despite the flashing red lights of the ambulance growing closer, I felt a growing sense of dread. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only seeing part of the story. Mrs. Whitaker, always so rigid, so proper, had been hiding something. And whatever it was, I had just scratched the surface. As the paramedics entered, they quickly took over, moving with swift precision. They checked her vitals and started asking her questions, but Mrs. Whitaker was barely responding. She wasn't fighting them, but she wasn't being completely cooperative either. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, wondering what had caused this sudden change. One of the paramedics, a tall woman with short hair, turned to me as she worked. Do you know if she's had any medical history? Any conditions we should know about? She asked. I don't know, I stammered, my mind racing. I had spent time with Mrs. Whitaker, gotten to know her little by little, but I had never once asked her about her health. I wasn't sure why I never thought to ask. She was always so self-reliant, so proud. But now, seeing her in this condition, I felt a pang of guilt for not having known more about her life, about her struggles. I'll keep her stable for now, the paramedic said, her voice calm. But we're going to need to get her to the hospital. You should come with us if you're able. She may need someone there. I nodded, my mind whirling. As they gently lifted Mrs. Whitaker onto the stretcher, I felt an unexpected knot tighten in my chest. The paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, and I followed close behind, the doors sliding shut with a soft hiss. The small town, the one that had felt like a quiet, predictable place for so long, was now buzzing with uncertainty. I couldn't help but feel that this moment, this quiet, unexpected crisis, was the beginning of something bigger. And as the ambulance drove away, with the flashing lights illuminating the dark streets, I was left with a single, unsettling thought. What had Mrs. Whitaker been hiding? The mystery lingered, unanswered, hanging heavy in the air. I had no way of knowing yet, but I felt certain of one thing. This wasn't the last time I would be stepping into her world. And the truth, whatever it was, would soon come to light.